Today I'll be presenting a subset of my dissertation research in which I study selenium ecotoxicology in North Carolina lakes that receive coal combustion residual from associated coal-fired power plant effluents. This work has recently been submitted for peer review, but it hasn't been accepted yet, and so for the time being, this is not available for reuse. The United States has a tremendous electricity demand, and we meet this demand using a variety of renewable and non-renewable resources that are differentiated by color on this map of the United States here. Coal is one of the most important and is widely used, and you can see that with the gray circles that are distributed throughout the states. North Carolina generates the majority of its electricity using coal. In the state, there are 14 coal-fired power plants, with 64 coal ash impoundments among them, and collectively these contain 19 billion gallons of coal ash. And we know from recent work done at Duke University that effluents coming from these coal-fired power plants are elevated in many dissolved constituents. This figure from Rule et al. In 2012 shows the relative concentrations coming from plants with and without scrubber systems installed. And my research focuses on selenium, which is particularly interesting and important from an ecotoxicological perspective. Well, why is that? Selenium is an essential nutrient, meaning that all of us require some amount of selenium to be considered optimally healthy. And we know that in the environment, concentrations increase substantially between abiotic compartments, or non-living compartments, and those that are living. This is often an increase from the parts per billion to the parts per million range, which represents three orders of magnitude difference. Selenium biotransforms from inorganic species to organic species in the food web, and this makes it more readily available to consumers to absorb and store in their tissues. Once it's in these food webs, selenium persists there and behaves more like a contaminant. And in fact, some organic forms of selenium have a very narrow margin of safety. And this is especially, which means that concentrations that are not that much greater than those that we need can be toxic. And this is especially true for aquatic animals that lay eggs. So think about fish or aquatic birds. The toxic effects of this exposure are most readily pronounced in the early life stages of animals when they are developing most rapidly. And selenium is a known problem in the context of coal combustion residual effluents to freshwater lakes. And this is illustrated by 3 case studies that all occurred in the 1970s, 2 of which occurred in this state and not too far from here. Belews Lake and Hyco Lake are just north and northeast, or northwest of where we are today. In these cases, researchers observed that many species of fish were eliminated from the lakes altogether, and among the fish that remained, there were high levels of deformities. The effects were eventually tied to effluent streams that had high selenium content that were coming from the associated coal-fired power plants into the reservoirs. And the problems were shown to persist long after inputs were reduced or terminated altogether because concentrations of selenium had built up in the sediments, and this continued to feed or to promote higher concentrations in the water column and in biological tissues. Partially in response to this, the US EPA established a first set of national criteria in 1987 serving to better protect the ecosystem health. In the present study, we wanted to develop a deeper understanding of the current selenium status in North Carolina waters and some of the factors that contribute to this, which include lake residence time, lake trophic status, and the amount of selenium that is being loaded from the coal-fired power plants. We focused on lakes because of their prolonged retention potential, which provides the extended opportunity for selenium to build up in the sediments and to transfer through the food web. 3 of the lakes in North Carolina that receive coal combustion residuals were selected for the study. The rest of the sites discharge into river systems. And these lakes were paired with reference lakes on the basis of trophic status and geographical location. On the left side of the screen, we have lakes in the mountain region of North Carolina. The impacted lake in this pair is Mountain Island Lake, which is associated with Riverbend Steam Station. In the Piedmont, we have the lakes that are found in the blue counties. The impacted lake here is Mayo Lake, continues to receive effluent from Mayo Steam Plant. And in the coastal plain, we have the last two lakes, with the impacted lake being Sutton Lake, which is associated with the Sutton Steam Station. In collaboration with the Wildlife Resource Commission, all of this field sampling was conducted in the spring of 2015. We collected surface water and sediments for pore water extraction, processed these according to established methods, and analyzed them by ICP-MS. We also collected 4 resident fish species from each of these lakes, subsampled them for tissues that are characteristically used in bioaccumulation studies, and analyzed these by ICP-MS as well. To understand the selenium burden at these lakes, it was also important to understand how much selenium has been loaded into the lakes in recent years. We have selenium loading on this first graph for Mountain Island Lake. The black dots represent loading, and they are shown on the left y-axis, which is on a log scale. On the right y-axis, we have the concentration of selenium that was measured in the effluents. Is represented by the red symbols and connected by the red line. We have very limited data from the associated coal-fired power plant at this site, but it's enough to indicate that loading was pretty low, at least in over the last 5 years. At Mayo Lake, which receives effluent from the Mayo Steam Station, we have quite a bit more data that shows us that the average loading of selenium in the same time period was an order of magnitude greater than it was at the previous lake. And at Sutton Lake in the coastal plain, we have the highest loading rate of 0.85 kilograms of selenium per day, which is nearly 1 kilogram. These lakes are also very different in their residence time. Mountain Island Lake, which has the lowest loading rate, also has the shortest retention time and behaves more similarly to a river. Mayo Lake has a prolonged retention time of 3 years. And at Sutton Lake, where we have the highest loading rate, we also have a residence time that might be considered semi-permanent. The water level is manipulated by Duke Energy through a pump to the Cape Fear River, and so this is variable, and the retention time can be considered very long or semi-permanent for this reason. In June of this year, the US EPA published updated National Chronic Aquatic Life Selenium criteria under the Clean Water Act, in which they lower the surface water criteria level from 5 micrograms per liter to 1.5 micrograms per liter. And most importantly, they include and prioritize tissue-specific criteria for the first time. These are for fish tissues, and the criteria are available for muscle tissue and ovary egg tissue. These threshold levels are 11.3 ppm and 15.1 ppm, or parts per million, respectively. And we can analyze the results of our study against these threshold levels. Here we have the water concentrations for the 6 lakes studied. There are 3 graphs shown from left to right in geographic order, such that the mountains are shown on the left and the coastal plain is shown on the right, and the Piedmont is in the middle. Within each graph, the impacted lake is compared directly to its paired reference lake. The red circles represent samples taken from the impacted site, and the white circles with the black outline represent those from the reference site. And the threshold level is indicated here as well, traveling horizontally through each graph on the y-axis. Mountain Island Lake, on the far left, has elevated concentrations of selenium in its waters relative to those from the reference lake. These are all well below the threshold level. If we consider this in the context of retention time and the rate of loading of selenium from the coal-fired power plant, we can summarize that this might be what we expect. Not that much is loaded, it doesn't stay in the system very long, and this is reflected by the lower concentrations. If we move to the Piedmont, we have Mayo Lake, where concentrations are again elevated relative to those in the reference lake. And one of the pore waters that was taken from sediment collected right near the effluent discharge is elevated above this threshold level. This reflects that the lake has a longer residence time and a higher loading rate. And at Sutton Lake, where we have the longest residence time and the largest loading rate, we have concentrations in surface waters exceeding the threshold level, at least in all locations that we sampled. I also want to mention here that we didn't measure selenium in whole sediments for this study, and this was because from an ecotoxicological perspective, pore water concentrations are a potential source of exposure to organisms that are laid in eggs either on the sediment surface or just beneath that surface. We have a similar setup for tissue concentrations measured in fish and the fish species collected for this study. All fish species are shown here in aggregate, so all tissues were combined. Similarly, the graphs are arranged in geographic order from the mountain region to the coastal plain. Individual tissue types that were sampled are marked on the x-axis, and concentration is shown on the y-axis. And you'll remember that the EPA has issued threshold levels specific for 2 tissue types, and these are muscle and ovary tissues. These are indicated here on each graph with the orange checked bars. In Mountain Island Lake, and Owl Lakes actually, all tissues taken from fish collected in impacted lakes are elevated significantly relative to those from reference lakes. All of these levels are below threshold values in the mountain region. And as we move eastward, we see an increasing number of samples exceeding this threshold. Taken together, these data support that lakes in North Carolina that receive coal combustion residuals have a substantial selenium burden. This is reflected by elevated surface and pore water concentrations in the impacted lakes relative to those in reference lakes, as well as a significantly elevated selenium concentrations in all biological tissues from fish collected in impacted lakes versus those in reference lakes. We observed several exceedances of federal threshold levels. And interestingly, the tissues in these exceeding lakes are comparable to those measured at Ballew's Lake during the extirpation events in the 1970s. A recent assessment of juvenile fish in Sutton Lake reported a deformity incidence of 28.9%. If we analyze this number against the teratogenic deformity index, this would lead us to expect a 7.2% mortality rate among these deformed fish as a direct cause of their deformities. There's also a large repository of selenium that's harbored in Sutton Lake sediments. And this will continue to promote elevated concentrations in the water column as well as in biological tissues long after inputs are permanently terminated. But importantly, these inputs have not been terminated yet. Under the North Carolina Coal Ash Management Act of 2014, several facilities are excavating their ash to dry landfill. These, the ash ponds at Sutton Lake and Mountain Island Lake are among those that are currently being excavated. But before the facilities can move the ash, they are drawing down the water level in these ponds by continuing to discharge effluent through the same outfalls that they discharged effluent in the past. The underlying source of this problem is the inherent high selenium content in the coal itself. North Carolina primarily gets its coal from West Virginia, and West Virginia more broadly belongs to the Appalachian coal region, which is known for its high selenium coals. Appalachia supplies 22% of domestic coal demand and 67% of the coal that we export to other countries. Individually, West Virginia supplies 35% of US coal exports. And this indicates that ecosystems on an international scale are at a similar risk when ashes are generated and disposed of and treated in a similar way as they are here in North Carolina. Lastly, I want to mention that selenium is just one component of coal combustion residual mixtures. And these lakes not only support, but they also promote recreational and subsistence fishing activity. So it's important that we keep both ecosystem and human health in mind in these contexts. With that, I would like to thank a large amount of people who helped me a lot with this work, and I'm happy to take any questions.